program. At the center is Japan Initiative. He's a Japan scholar. His name is Nobuo Fukuda. He's a journalist on leave at the moment from the Asahi Shimbun, where he's had 25 years of experience. The Asahi Shimbun, of course, as many of you will know, is Japan and the world's second largest circulation newspaper. At the Asahi, he was the Jakarta bureau chief. He was also a European correspondent and had assignments in Afghanistan and Iraq. He's also written for Aera, which is, I guess, the equivalent of Time magazine in Japan, maybe. One could say Newsweek, but Japan has a Japanese language Newsweek. And he's also won awards for his journalism, most notably the Japan Congress of Journalism Award for a series he did on the role of Japanese newspapers, including the Asahi, in Japan's World War II occupation and invasion and occupation of Asian nations. Normally I say at these events that it's our pleasure to have hosted Nobuo for these past couple of months under the auspices of the Japan Scholar Program, and we're sad to see him go. But actually he's going to stay on in Washington for another year and a half and work on this project of open nationalism, which he'll be discussing today, which I understand he'll eventually turn into a book. So we look forward to seeing the results of that research. Without further ado, I think I'll hand things over to Nobu.
Thank you very much, Bryce, for the kind introduction. Fortunately, I'm going to stay, at the Woodrow Research Center and continue working on my research. Today I'm going to talk about nationalism, and especially that of Asia. This is a theme I've been working on for the past 3 months here at the Wilson Center. And actually, this might have been too formidable a task for me, maybe too ambitious. And I would say I've come maybe even halfway. I haven't. So I'm really glad that Wilson Center could keep me affiliated with, beyond my term, as a Japan scholar. The reason why I chose nationalism as my research topic here is well, nationalism is still very powerful political and ideological force and likely to have profound influence on the region and beyond for quite some time to come. The question is whether nationalism should be regarded in a strictly negative sense. Parts of my research suggest otherwise. Nationalism can play a positive role even in shaping Asia's future. The term open nationalism, today's title, may not sound familiar to you. It is a concept that I would like to think of as the brand of nationalism, which is conducive to democracy, peace, human rights, pluralism, religious inclusivism, openness, and so forth. I found the prototypes of open nationalism in thoughts and actions of nationalist leaders in the past. One example is India's Mohandas Gandhi. It's been said about him, no other leader in history in his own lifetime has done so much to make a people into a nation. Gandhi's nationalism is unique. He claimed that India's collective identity must be rooted in a nonviolent soul force or truth force in the national struggle for independence. Gandhi also declared that his nationalist vision was all-inclusive. Another example is China's Sun Yat-sen, or Sun Wen, who is revered as the founding father of modern China by both communists on the mainland and nationalists in Taiwan. In building a new nation-state of China in early 20th century, Sun developed the three fundamental principles of people: combining democracy with nationalism and people's livelihood. According to Sun, China should be friendly to neighbors, support weak nations, and fight imperialism, probably with Confucian ethics. I should also make clear on what I mean by nationalism. I like to think of nationalism as political thoughts and movements for nation building, or it could be simply people's feelings towards their countries in general. Well, I like to start with a case study of Indonesia, where I was based, as Bryce introduced, in late 1990s, since I believe the role played by open nationalism in Indonesia's democratic transition for the past decade deserves more attention. In my talk, I like to examine how Indonesia pacified the conflict-stricken communities, prevented fragmentation of their multi-ethnic nation, and established a representative government. Indonesia is a vast archipelago. It's around here. This is Sumatra, main island Java, and Bali. This is Kalimantan or Borneo. And this is the western half of New Guinea also belongs to Indonesia. It's a 3,000 miles, more than 3,000 miles wide, split in 3 time zones. The population, 250 million, and 80% of it are Muslims. Right. And this and the people belong to 500 ethnic groups. This multi-ethnic state was created under the Dutch colonial rule in the 19th century. To the left, this gentleman in army uniform is President Suharto. When I started covering Indonesia as my newspaper's Jakarta bureau chief in 1994, President Suharto had been in power for nearly 30 years already. He was a former army officer who quickly rose to power by suppressing successfully the abortive coup, which was allegedly instigated by the communists. His regime was a typical authoritarian developmentalist government. Its policies were solely focused on the nation's economic growth. As the national economy grew at 6 to 7% in average annually in many years of his reign, but it was an illiberal society. Direct criticism of Suharto would not be allowed, and corruption was rampant. Suharto's own children enriched themselves by monopolizing such lucrative businesses as broadcasting, developing resort hotels in the island of Bali, and manufacturing autos. And Suharto failed to rein them, and they agreed. So for people, there were a lot to complain about. Suharto's trouble started when the devastating financial crisis hit the region in July 1997. The currencies, including Indonesian rupiah, Thai baht, and Malaysian ringgit, nosedived, and national economies rapidly contracted. Despite free-falling currency, 77-year-old Suharto easily secured another re-election, his 7th term, by the rubber-stamped parliament in March 1998. People got angry. Patriotic students took to the street and demanded that the president step down right away. The picture to the right is, those demonstrators are the students of Trisakti University of Jakarta. Actually, 4 of their friends were shot dead, presumably by the army snipers. And it's kind of small, but The flags, they're flying here. These are Indonesian national flags of red and white stripes. What they insisted on the street was their nation was stolen by Suharto and his children, and his cronies, and the military. So they pledged to take it back to the people. So they regard themselves as patriotic students. The urban poor set fire and looted shopping malls owned by ethnic Chinese. Among the riot and clashes, Suharto announced his resignation in the morning of May 21st, 1998. Then Indonesia's transition officially commenced. In the wake of mass public demonstration, the forced President Suharto to resign. Democratization was an imperative. Baharudin Yusuf Habibie, Suharto's vice president, took over presidency according to the constitution and initiated political liberalization. One of the first acts carried out by the Habibie government was to revoke all of the laws and regulations that had constrained freedom of speech, association, and gatherings, and to release political prisoners. In the initial period of Indonesia's democratic transition, the wave of communal unrest caused approximately 19,000 deaths. It provoked grave fears that Indonesia was on the verge of a process of national disintegration, similar to that which destroyed Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union. In each of these conflicts, local people vented long suppressed grievances about excessive central government control and neglect or violation of local interests. Most of these conflicts also involved competition among local elites for control of local government and access to patronage resources that this provided. Had there been Suharto, he would have sent in the army and cracked down on the rioters. Certainly, one argument for authoritarianism was that it would effectively prevent secessionist movements. But in a new Indonesia being democratized, an armed suppression could not be an option. Instead, the government introduced the far-reaching decentralization policies. Most important was the devolution of political and financial power that the Habibie government began in 1999. Considerable political powers and control over a good part of the state budget transferred to regional governments at the district and mayoralty level, the second tier of regional governments, rather than to the first tier, the provinces. This policy was introduced after intensive debates among officials, parliamentarians, scholars, and foreign advisors. The political climate at the time was strongly in favor of regional autonomy. Nevertheless, many members of the cabinet insisted that autonomy should only be given to the second tier of government, the district mayoralty level. Ostensibly, this was to bring government and public services closer to the people. But the real reason was based on fear that giving autonomy to provinces, which are larger and stronger administrative units, will lead to federalism. That was not what Indonesian nationalists wanted to see. Another core element of the decentralization policies are the direct elections of governors, regions, and mayors that began in June 2005. During the Suharto era, those top officials of regional institutions were appointed by local parliaments, which were dominated by government party, Golkar. Many of them were military officers. In provinces, generals held governorship. In districts, colonels followed suit. Instead, now, it is the electorate that determines directly who will head their local government. Nevertheless, the new electoral rules will not drastically change the composition of the political and economic elites competing for positions of power. Major groups in the field of nominees are career bureaucrats, wealthy business people, party politicians, and retired and active military officers. Those four groups accounted for 94% of all the candidates in the first direct local elections in history of Indonesia held in 2005. One of the main reasons for this is that it simply takes a lot of money to compete in elections. Parties also lack credible candidates from either their own ranks, from their own ranks. However, widespread fears that incumbents would easily rise to victory proved unfounded, with 40% of office holders losing their jobs. The increased maturity of the electorate was not only reflected in its determination to replace incompetent incumbents, but also in its inclination to reject candidates who campaigned on exclusivist platforms. Prior to the 2005 polls, many observers have been concerned that nominees might aim to attract votes by appealing to their partisan instincts, such as identification with a certain religion, ethnic group, or family clan, by even fueling prejudices and sentiments against rival social groups. In most cases, such maneuverings did not occur. Instead, candidates in heterogeneous regions tended to form cross-cultural tickets. For example, having a Muslim candidate for district chief and a Christian for vice regent. They tried to address the moderate attitude of the electorate and hoped to gain additional votes from alternative constituencies. The moderation of the electorate was also the main reason for the absence of communal violence during the course of the elections. Voters also did not confirm widespread predictions that active and retired military officers would do exceptionally well in the polls, paving the way for the remilitarization of Indonesian politics. With lower class and outsider candidates largely excluded from electoral competition, Indonesia's direct local poll still lacks political equality. However, from the limited pool of nominees, voters generally picked candidates with better track records and higher credibility. In short, the local elections have empowered Indonesian voters to have a significant say in the outcome of inter-elite, at least, competition for political and economic power. National electoral reform was also important. Since 1999, Indonesia has used variants of proportional representation in which members of parliament are elected from multi-seat districts. Proposal by liberal Democrats who wanted to improve accountability of elected representatives to voters by introducing single-seat districts have always been rejected by nationalist Democrats. The grounds were often that such an approach would introduce a winner-take-all attitude that could endanger Indonesia's ethnic and religious pluralism. Yet, one important safeguard was built into the system. In order to register for and run in elections, parties had to show that they had a broad national presence with functioning branches in a large proportion of the country's provinces and districts. That means political parties have to be national, and the exclusion of local parties has prevented Indonesia's national institutions from becoming a battleground for organized regional and ethnic interests. At the same time, proportional representation has produced a highly fragmented party system in which no single party is able to dominate. This fragmentation has created a climate of cross-party alliance building and deal-making. It is not conducive to effective governance, but it is positive for preserving pluralism and preventing the escalation of communal tensions. The revolution also delivered blossoming of local democracy. The same inclusivist impulses that govern national politics came to determine local political dynamics too. Indonesians have paid a price for the reform too. The nation has no shortage of ambitious and potentially violent ethnic elites. These spoilers have been accommodated and absorbed into the system rather than excluded from it. The prizes are construction contracts, land deals, bureaucratic appointments, or other benefits. If they fail to satisfy them, spoilers could also hope to carve in new districts. Create a new district where they could dominate. Because many of these political bosses drew on ethnic constituencies, those arrangements help to diminish communal tension by drawing ethnic elites into the web of patronage distribution. While I was based in Jakarta, the number of provinces was only 27. Now it is 33. The number of districts reached 417 in 2009. It was around 300 4 years before. These phenomena may highlight a trade-off between democratic successes and democratic quality in Indonesia's recent transition. Nevertheless, a decade on, Indonesia has survived intact, rather than leading to a furious spiral that could have consumed the nation. Most of the violent conflicts of the early post-Suharto years have been extinguished. Secessionist movements have been diffused. Now, I'd like to move to India. Let's see. And let's see. Back to Gandhi's country. Despite Mahatma Gandhi's example of nonviolence, India has experienced much bloodshed in recent decades. A half-century since independence, India is racked by small wars, from caste conflict in Bihar and tribal insurgencies in the northeast to periodic fighting with Pakistani soldiers or guerrillas in Kashmir. Among them, I'm particularly interested in the rise of Hindu nationalism. The picture of the top left, that shows a notorious incident in 1992. The 16th century Babur Mosque, Islamic mosque, of course, in the northern Indian city of Ayodhya was demolished by a mob of Hindu nationalists. The subsequent rioting led to the deaths of more than 1,000 people in a number of Indian cities. The violence after Ayodhya changed the daily life of communities in many parts of India for the worst and helped raise communal conflict to unprecedented levels in the 1990s. Hindu nationalist mobs have attacked couples, shops, and restaurants during Valentine's Day. They violently enforce dress codes on women university students. Dalits, previously known as untouchables, the Christians, and in tribal areas, violent conversion campaigns into Islam have been carried out. The movement is called Hindu nationalism, since it's been more influenced by nationalism than by religion. For the members of Hindu nationalist groups, such as the political party BJP or the RSS, the largest existing private paramilitary body in the world, those pictures to the right, top and bottom, are both the activities of RSS. Hinduism, for them, Hinduism is above all a symbol of Indian national identity. The BJP held only 2 seats at around 500-strong parliament in 1984. It came to the biggest party in about a decade and came to power in 1998. The astonishing political rise of Hindu nationalism cannot be separated out from the processes of political pluralism that was set in motion after the mid-1960s. Decentralization reflects the fact that India has become more democratic. an increasing number of Indians participate in the political process. The rise of Hindu nationalism can also be seen as an authoritarian, higher caste response to widening democratization, especially related to the social and political rise of non-elite caste and Dalits, previously known as the untouchables. Dalits, upper class caste Indians resent the privileges enjoyed by the Dalits and backward caste, such as university placement and state employment, and they have become more assertive in the political process. Here I see another interesting interaction between nationalism and democratization. Nonviolence, secularism, pluralism, rule of law, all key elements of open nationalism have been eroded by exclusivist ethno-religious nationalism, which has exploited India's democratization. Unlike Indonesia, Indian voters choose their representatives in single-seat constituencies. Since the electoral decline of the Congress Party, no one party dominates political life any longer. Only Congress and BJP are national parties. As a result, both national and local institutions have been captured by ethnically exclusivist movements. I do not mean to say that Indonesians are doing better job than Indians, but it may be said that even consolidated democracy like that of India could be rolled back by the kind of nationalism that is not open and not sympathetic to others. Hindu nationalists also ignore significant historical facts, such as peaceful Hindu and Muslim interaction in India for centuries and their common cause during the nationalist struggle against British rule. Tension exists between them, the majority group Hindus and the minority Muslims, with family and cultural ties to a powerful neighboring country, Pakistan. Pakistan takes a keen interest in the treatment of this minority. The attack in Ayodhya in 1992, this one, above all, a reflection of the Hindu nationalist perception of Muslims as inherently alien. Deep religious differences also create international friction between India and Pakistan. They thereby contribute to India's most dangerous security threat, made worse by the mutual acquisition of nuclear weapons in 1998. Let me apologize for the busy trip, but I like move to east, to China. This is the June 4th movement, which shook China in 1989. Excuse me. If I may go back to briefly to Indonesia in 1989. Sorry for the busy trip, but as we cover the downfall of Suharto, what came as a kind of reminiscent to the mind of every one of us reporters, was this crackdown. I mean, that followed exactly 9 years before in Jakarta. Then tens of thousands of students, demonstrators, were occupying Tiananmen Square in downtown Beijing with help from citizens working to block troop movements. On May 20, 1989, Deng Xiaoping, then 85-year-old and still the most powerful of the Chinese Communist Party, decided to proclaim martial law in Beijing. Chao Tian, Deng's handpicked CCP Communist Party Secretary General, resigned in protest. He wanted to open talks with the students, even after People's Daily newspaper branded them as a handful of counter-revolutionaries on Deng Xiaoping's order. On June 4th, tanks of the People's Liberation Army rolled into the downtown Beijing to force out the students of Tiananmen Square. And the assault killed at least a few thousand students and other protesters. Back in Jakarta, we were afraid of witnessing another Tiananmen unfolding on the streets of Jakarta. Fortunately, it didn't take place. The president resigned, and the overjoyed crowd and demonstrators quickly lost steam. The soldiers went back to the barracks. Indonesia's democratizations followed. Faced with similarly determined protesters demanding that the political system be reformed, Indonesian president chose to step down, and China's supreme leader chose to crack down. I found this contrast an interesting theme to pursue. What stands out in South Asia's record are that major political transformations have nearly always been bottom-up, not top-down. The examples are the People Power Movement in the Philippines, the Black May incident wherein the army fired on protesters in Bangkok in Thailand in 1991 and Jakarta in 1989. Intuitively, I suspect that this regularity might have applied to China in 1989. Had the CCP, the Communist Party, given in to the democracy movement, would the party have fallen from power? Tibet and Xinjiang seceded? A hypothetical question, but it might have been highly likely. The regime's dodged protest containment efforts since then may suggest its view on the danger of mass protests. In the wake of Tiananmen, the Communist Party has been careful to prevent the emergence of anything resembling an alternative political organization. Anti-government demonstrations were strictly forbidden. When a protest erupts in a factory or a village, the authorities may negotiate or they may send in the police. The police were everywhere, and the fear of repression was overwhelming. And most of the leaders who were active in 1989 were in exile, or in hiding, or in jail. Over the last 2 decades, any large-scale social movement comparable to the democracy movement in 1989 has been absent. There was almost no space for expression of dissent. The crackdown in 1989 has also cast a long shadow over Chinese nationalism. In the pro-democracy movement in the spring of 1989, the student demonstrators sought to promote China's strength and dignity through the implementation of democratic political reforms that guarantees human rights and equality before the law. The students regarded themselves as the embodiment of the Chinese patriotism and the vanguard of the legal and political reforms needed to end China's stagnation. Chao Tian, then the party's Secretary General, kept calling demonstrators patriots and insisting their voice to be heard. Jiang Zemin, who replaced Chao Tian as the party Secretary General, launched patriotic campaigns soon after the Tiananmen crackdown. The campaign received another boost from the handover of Hong Kong in July 1997, the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, the 1999 Belgrade Embassy bombing, and the Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi's numerous visits to the Yasukuni Shrine, the major war memorial in Japan. After Tiananmen, Chinese students have been obliged to submit to military exercises under army supervision. So nationalism is the partly fruit of patriotic education. However, the emerging intellectual discourse on nationalism has been largely independent of official propaganda. In the dominant Chinese political language, patriotism has specific connotations. The object to be loved is a state, and the Communist Party. And one of the key elements of Chinese nationalism is this strong loyalty to the Communist Party. Currently, state nationalism is anti-democratic and refuses to take democratic path. This is due partly to the fact that nationalists believe democratization is likely to empower ethno-nationalism and thus undermine state nationalism like we saw in India. In short, open nationalism in China was crushed on June 4th in 1989 and has been suppressed nearly completely since then. Here I'd like to switch topics to my native Japan. Having studied the nationalism of Indonesia, India, and China, I have been struck with a stark contrast with that of Japan. The former three had a lot in common from its inception as a movement against colonizing powers. Japan's nationalism has led a dramatically different trajectory for the past 150 years. From its birth as a reaction to the Western impact that cracked open the country that was closed for more than 200 years during the feudal Tokugawa era, Japan's nationalism was oriented toward a strong and prosperous state. The major leaders thought that would be necessary to avoid being invaded and colonized by Western powers. But when that decision was made, Japan's nationalism was also destined to become authoritarian one, linked with war and expansion. Who was effective for developing the nationalistic spirit of the young empire? Japan kept emerging on the winning side against China, against Russia in the First World War. And Japan invaded China again in 1937 and committed a reckless war against the United States and Britain in 1941. But it defeated, the empire surrendered unconditionally. With U.S. occupation forces controlling every phase of social and political life, Japan was forced to seek independence just like other nations in Asia. Nationalism was affected by the long occupation by the Allied militaries from 1945 to 1952. The attitude of the occupation authorities was strongly reformist and anxious to eliminate the excesses of pre-war nationalism. There was strong emphasis on democratization, which the Americans regarded as the antithesis of nationalism. When the occupation ended in 1952, the Japanese recovered sovereignty. Democratization was carried forward by the conservative leaders. Many of them were former fascists who regrouped themselves as the liberal Democrats. So unlike the Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, who struggled to acquire self-rule and democracy, they were given to the Japanese from above. There existed, of course, a sense of patriotism, which expressed itself in fierce determination for improvement and recovery. In reaction to the war, there was a broadly pacifist spirit among the Japanese. Its military operations were limited by Article 9 of its new constitution. Its dependence on U.S. for defense meant that Japan took a low profile, in foreign affairs. As a conservative government set the policy goal of doubling the national income in 10 years in 1960, people became more conscious of economic growth than political independence. In early 1970s, there came an awareness that Japan had become a prosperous country and a trading giant on the world stage. Within 2 decades, however, Japanese found that the economy would no longer be able to grow. As the economic slump has continued and social and political reform stagnant since then, the level of people's frustration is quite high. Some analysts say that the persistent sense of loss may be partly explained by the lack of progressive nationalism. Japanese are simply unable to find another national goal to replace economic growth. As many of you have known, the northeastern Japan was struck by massive tsunamis last month. And it's been said nationalism manifests itself more openly only in months of crisis. And as Prime Minister Naoto Kan describes the crisis as the worst for the past 6 decades, what I expect is very lively debates, discussing where nations should be oriented, arise from this crisis. But that's not what I've seen yet. However, what I would like to suggest is that Japan should explore a new national identity in Asia. The region it belongs to geographically, but it never was accepted as a full member. In order to be a valuable part of the region, Japan should pursue open nationalism as a backbone of its foreign policy. What I like also propose is kind of reconciliation of nationalisms with other Asian nations. Despite the fact that it has benefited from open economy and globalization, Japan is still a relatively closed country. One example is its unwillingness to open door to foreign workers. Only 1% of the total workforce accounts for foreigners in Japan, even though there has been a grave concern about labor shortage during the demographic aging rapidly progressing. Japan has been criticized for its reluctance to accept refugees, even from neighboring countries. If open nationalism succeeds in Asia, peace, prosperity, and stability will be enhanced regionally. It will benefit the nations in the region, but above all, Japan. I am hoping to see a close-knit regional grouping emerging as a result. Japan should work toward an East Asian community wherein elements of open nationalism should be enhanced and fostered. Let me state a brief conclusion. In monitoring democracy's progress, Southeast Asia used to be evaluated as the world's backwater. Indonesia's authoritarian politics under Suharto gained particular resilience. But even if delayed by various forces, democracy finally arrived in Southeast Asia. Analysts have sometimes understood these democratic pressures as an atavistic manifestation. The Japanese political scientist Masao Maruyama observes, in Asia, the fusion of nationalism and democracy was historically logical, given the dual questions of achieving independence from colonizers and emancipation of the people. If I follow his theory, where nationalism, particularly open nationalism, is around, democratization will eventually take place, as in the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. Even in China, where open nationalism has been suppressed, the possibility could not be denied. There are lively discussions on politics go on at tea houses, bookshops, and in cyberspaces where millions of citizens participated. The nations will keep asking, what kind of Japan, what kind of China, what kind of India, what kind of Indonesia they like to have, they like to build. Some scholars, such as David Miller, insist that nationalism fosters debate within civil society, thus benefiting democracy. It might be an alternative view of nationalism, but I like to agree with them, as they argue that democratization hardly occurs unless nationalism stimulates the otherwise dormant and inactive civil and political societies. According to political scientist Maruyama again, Japan alone completed one full cycle of nationalism, birth, maturity, and decline by 1945. While Japan struggles to reestablish its national identity in post-war, in its second run, other nations in Asia are still on the road of the initial nation building. If so, it might be too early to conclude where their nationalisms will end up. I would like to invest in open nationalism in Asia in the long term. I'd like to stop here. Good. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay.
Comments and questions?
Yes, okay, thank you, Nobu. I'll kick things off, I think. One of the things that struck me about your analysis of nationalism in particularly Indonesia was that it seemed to be a force, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that disparate groups within Indonesia seized upon as a way of creating a unified community, and therefore the emphasis on proportional representation and what have you. After Suharto, people needed something to bring them together, and the nation seemed to be the logical choice. I wonder how this would work in Japan, given the typical representation, at least, of Japan as ethnically homogeneous, non-diverse, a nation that has traditionally been seen as conformist. Is there space for open nationalism when I guess there isn't a need to emphasize national togetherness in that sense?
Thank you, Bryce. I found the answer already in your question. The homogeneity, of the Japanese nation, almost nearly 100% of the people living there regard themselves as ethnic Japanese. Not exactly 100%. That's the big difference between Indonesia, where the biggest ethnic group of the Japanese comprise only 40% of the whole population. One theory goes, in a country where the biggest ethnic group proportion makes up less than 50% of the whole population, the democracy will be very difficult to get in place. So if it applies everywhere, Japan would be one of the easiest countries, for the people to have democracy in place. I think, that theory has been verified. With historical facts. Whereas I'm not sure if it has, but the trajectory the Japanese nation has led for the past 60 years kind of suggests that the Japan realized its democracy kind of without,
sure,
a lot of difficulties.
I think
compared to other nations in Asia.
I think I wanted to focus on nationalism rather than democracy, but we'll move on from there. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand. Before you ask it, there will be somebody coming around with a microphone. Could you please identify yourself by your name and any affiliations you might have? Gil.
I'm Gil Rosman of Princeton University and here at the Wilson Center. And I found it interesting how you were drawing together three themes. Ethnicity as a problem that has to be overcome in some countries in order to develop open nationalism. Democracy as something you consider nation building and contributing to a certain kind of nationalism. And regionalism. And although you didn't develop regionalism as much as the other themes, but you suggested the path to open nationalism in Asia is by Japan championing a kind of regionalism. I wonder if you could tell us more about the nature of that regionalism. You gave a few descriptions of it. Which countries are included? And does a country have to be democratic to be included? And what do you do with China in that case? And how do you balance China and deal with security issues if you are aspiring towards regionalism. And so you suggested that Japan could lead through reconciliation over history, but is that sufficient to provide a foundation for Sino-Japanese cooperation in regionalism?
Thank you very much. It's a very tough question to answer. At least I like to hope. I mean, I'm hoping to see a regional grouping that includes all nations that geographically belong to Asia. I mean, initially probably to East Asia. I mean, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. If I name all, I mean, 10 ASEAN countries and the China, and even Taiwan, North and South Korea, Japan, probably Mongolia. And they then expand the wing to South Asia, even India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And I don't think, it wouldn't have to be democracy for a nation to join the groupings. I like to think of elements of open nationalism as a kind of, basis of, collective identity that's the member nations of that grouping will be supposed to share. Like, of course, democracy is one of them, and the human rights, other values that some countries like China have not got in place yet. But, those are, the values, I mean, they should share as kind of common goals. I mean, as a political grouping to pursue, I mean, in the long term. As I stated in the end, I mean, I think Asia's nationalism will stay and be influential for long, long term, probably beyond the regime of the Communist Party in China. And I like to think of that grouping, I mean, functioning as a basis of, I mean, the regional integration, I mean, for the long, long term. I mean, maybe for the next century or something. And probably the nationalism I talked about, which came into being in early 20th century Asia, will outlive the current regimes, I mean, in the regions. But that regional grouping, I like to see to stay, I mean, and outlive, those regimes.
Thank you very much. I'm Robin White, retired Foreign Service, and I teach on contract at the Foreign Service Institute, a class on Japan. I'd appreciate your comments on where the younger generation seems to be in this, the people under 30 who face a lot of problems with part-time work or no work. But also I'm getting the sense that they are not very internationally minded. That's shown by statistics that show that students do not want to go overseas because they might miss a job opportunity, and people in large corporations are not keen on going overseas either. This would factor into kind of your sense of Japan as not welcoming immigrants. So to to have a healthy nationalism, you also have to have some sort of sense of being internationally minded, and for the Japanese to have a healthy sense of their place in the world. How can people under 30 get this sense? Japan seems to lack think tanks and discussion groups like this, so I'd appreciate your comments. Maybe I'm missing something.
Thank you. It's becoming a problem that for younger generations to have a tendency to stay, in Japan, and it's true that they wouldn't like to go abroad, even for brief trips, and because they have difficulties, as you said, in finding jobs or whatever, and the economic slump, which has been persistent for the past decades, also explains part of it. And so I think younger generation, only those young people shouldn't be held responsible for their inward-looking or introvert mentalities. Rather, the nation as a whole is very even more inward-looking. These years. Apparently resulting from the economic slump. Probably, I might be wrong, but the tsunami and the earthquakes, which hit northeast part of Japan, might be might provide a kind of opportunity, for the nation to start debating again on where they should be, where they should go. Since if the Prime Minister is right, and the nation regarded as one of the most threatening threats. They are facing. Recently. I think they are supposed to come up with some solutions to that problem too. This is really, wishful thinking, but I've been anxious to see, the people, start discussing lively back in Japan on the future path of their nation. How they do it is a really big question. But nationalism is, it has a tendency to become visible when the nation faces crisis. So, another, wishful thinking though, but and I think they must.
Next question. Next. Kevin.
I'm Kevin Doak from Georgetown University. And before I can ask my question, I have to ask for your help with clarification. If you were to give this talk in Japanese, what Japanese word would you use for nationalism?
Excuse me, would you say that?
Mm-hmm. If you were to give this talk in Japanese, what would be the word you would use for the
Japanese
concept?
Language, you mean?
Japanese, Nihongo. What would you say? How would you say open nationalism?
I would say nationalism.
I thought so.
Katakana character, I would say nationalism.
So my question is, because you mentioned earlier that nationalism is as much about people's feelings as it is about nation building, do you really think you can overcome 100, 150 years of historical discourse on nationalism and the nation that has been structured in a way that has set Kokumin Shugi against Minzoku Shugi, in which Minzoku Shugi has been very Asian-oriented, but very ethnically limited, and Kokumin Shugi has been open, but very pro-Western. And so do you really think that you can discard all that history and create a borrowed gairaigo like nationalism and make it stick within the Japanese people's hearts?
Great question. I mean, that split of the traditional nationalism, I mean, is still visible. I think I agree with you. But the open nationalism I talked about probably suggests something different. I mean, even completely new conception of nationalism, which the Japanese nation should embrace for future, policy guidelines, especially for foreign relations with neighboring countries. I couldn't be very sure if we could overcome that split. I mean, overcome the 150-year history. But if Maruyama's theory I quoted in my talk were right, and we were in the second phase of the cycle of nationalism, I think that would be possible. I mean, or at least it would be easier than when we had been in the first phase to acquire that completely new national identity in the future.
Bob Hathaway here at the Wilson Center. Nobuo, I want to commend you, first of all, for daring to do something that not everybody is willing to do, and that is take a comparative approach, both in comparing different countries, but also covering different time periods. That's much more difficult than focusing on a single culture and a single discrete time period, and so I admire you for that. I'd like to make a very brief observation and then follow it up with an unrelated question. The observation has to do with the Indonesia example in the late 1990s. You and Bryce both talked about the diversity of the country and the need to engineer a sense of unity. I would simply point out, and you briefly mentioned this, that one of the ways in which, well, at the same time where much of the country and many of these groups were coming together, there was also extensive violence against the ethnic Chinese, which you referred to. And it struck me that I wonder if part of the process of bringing a diverse collection of groups together was facilitated by the very act of scapegoating a particular group. In this case, a particularly wealthy but proportionally relatively small group. The very act of making an enemy or a scapegoat or a boogeyman, if you will, out of one group might have served to promote what in other ways can be described as a pretty benign form of nationalism. So that's the comment. The question has to do, and it's really a follow-on with several of our questions, about how do you engineer, how do you instill open nationalism? My question has to do with whether or not it has to develop from within a country, or whether or not it can be transferred from one country to another, other than through military occupation, as of course occurred in Japan. But can one country, simply by force of example, encourage the development of this benign form of nationalism in a different country? Can public diplomacy help, or is that really irrelevant? Can the existence and exercise of soft power in and by one country, is that a means that might encourage the development of open nationalism in a different country? Or does it, at the end of the day, opposite use of military force, does it really have to come from within the country?
Thank you, Bob, for the question and the comments. I'd like to answer your question first. I mean, well, honestly, I'm hoping to see Japan to promote open nationalism in the region and eventually in the regional groupings. The big question is how. It's out of question to force open nationalism militarily. It will have to be definitely parts of the soft power that Japan will exert in the future. What I've been thinking is, what about Japan proposing something like a joint study of nationalism in the region? I mean, suggesting one nation examining another nation's nationalism, and the vice versa. Or, you know, we could study many nationalisms, I mean, that have been present in the region. And the probably we will come up with a lot of findings. I mean, and that might constitute fundamentals, I mean, on which we could promote the thoughts and movements of open nationalism in the region. And I'm not sure if you know, that kind of idea is relevant as a public foreign policy. I'm not really sure, but that's what I'd like to propose if I were the foreign minister of Japan to the neighboring countries. And on your comments on the Chinese minority in Indonesia, they were definitely scapegoated on the Sato. They were allowed to get rich, but they didn't have civil liberties and the political rights. And in the course of democratization, they have come back to Indonesia. Many of them fled, I mean, to Australia, Singapore, those places. But kind of encouraged by the change, I mean, they have come back to the business again in Indonesia. And I think, you know, they are pretty much settling in these days. They have been allowed to open Chinese schools even, which were banned under SART. And even Indonesian students these days go to Chinese schools. That's a big shift that we have witnessed these days. So it might take a while for them to get accommodated, I mean, completely. But I think, you know, so long as they see themselves Indonesians, even though they were ethnic Chinese, I think kind of we could be optimistic about. And so long as Indonesia stayed this course.
Well, with the rate of political turnover in Japan, you might just get your wish as foreign minister. Okay, who's next? This gentleman up the back.
Thank you very much, Takao from NHK. It is a very challenging topic, I definitely noticed, but what I want to, let me comment a little bit, and at the end, some question. I think some of the professor there said about the healthy nationalism. And I think that kind of word could be, defined here, maybe in the United States, but it's a bit difficult for, to understand what is the healthy democracy in Asian country, including Japan. What I mean is democracy and nationalism is such a, in some case in Asian countries, the opposite. Doesn't, go along with together. For example, in Japan, like nationalism reminds us of the militarism before the World War. And also like China, I think, China together with, Russia, where I stationed a lot of year, it's also under the communist period, they denied sort of the nationalism and they pursued communism in the world. So cosmopolitan in a sense. And so when I was working in Russia, I really felt that Russians got, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, first time they really pursued nationalism under Putin. And at that time, the slogan was anti-American. And I think China also, recent years, nationalism often connect to anti-Japan movement. So how can democracy and nationalism, the healthy nationalism can go along is, I think, one of the challenging theme in Asia. That's my understanding. So how do you think about that? And also, when you use about the nationalism, open nationalism for Asia, and especially for Japan after such a big tragedy, I also hope that sort of, nationalism, healthy nationalism will help Japan. But still I have such kind of concern using the word nationalism. So how can you sort of explain a little bit further about your usage of word nationalism?
Thank you, Takao-san. Good to see you. I agree with you. In describing, how nationalism was seen in Japan. It's a bad thing, in short. Still crazy right-wing war creed. That's, but I would say, might have been particularly unique, view in Japan, in Asia. In terms of the way how you see nationalism, Japan might be kind of exception in Asia, since in other countries, as I might have told you, nationalism is basically seen as a good thing, because it's an ideology of independence and national unity. So that's what I noticed when I started covering Asia. I didn't notice such a big difference, before I went there. So I'm not really sure. Yes, I think we need to kind of reconcile our views. If the Japanese are still very negative about developing, even healthy nationalism, if they like to totally stay away from nationalism for good, they could, but maybe they gotta find something else. And I'm not sure if it's such a good idea. And the compatibility of nationalism and other ideologies, like communism, like what you saw in Russia, or what we're seeing in China, might kind of suggest kind of similar kind of question, like my view might be kind of alternative, but I see kind of compatibility with, nationalism and democracy, nationalism, communism. Actually, it's a concept which goes with, any kind of ideology. Very, very flexible. Fascism needs nationalism. Fascism couldn't be in place without nationalism. But democracy also couldn't be in place without nationalism, since democracy is realized within a boundary community of a nation state. So I think that's the theme that we should discuss. But maybe we could reconcile. By discussing it, our differences.
Okay, I'm just going to ask a question quickly, and it's one that I think we could have a quick response to. Nationalism is often seen as this monolithic entity, as you say. A lot of people in Japan have a kind of negative response to the term because of the long history, because it implies right-wing nationalism, if you like. And but it's a little bit more diverse than that, I think. And there's left-wing nationalism as well as kind of moderate conservative nationalism, if you like. And for each of these nationalisms, there's sort of paraphernalia that goes along with it. So the right has yasukuni and denial of war crimes in a lot of cases. The centrists have a focus in the 80s on Japan's economic might and how that made Japan unique. The left had a focus on the constitution and Japan's experience through war, leading to the concept of a peace nation. I wonder, without going into abstraction, what would be the kind of paraphernalia of open nationalism? What is the kind of focal point that you could say here? This is the concrete manifestation of Japan that we believe in.
What I have in mind, as open nationalism, the kind of synthesis of, all kinds of nationalism kind of amalgamated into one. You wouldn't have to be right, or left, or pacifist, or militarist. Rather the elements, the major elements would be, as I talked, democracy, human rights, or civil liberties, either in the left or in the right. So long as those values were respected. I think I'm just wondering if that kind of nationalism will be possible. Since for the past, as you correctly said, the nationalism was happily married to the left, to the right, to the militarism, to pacifism. But probably in the 21st century, we might need completely new kind, which is conducive to some other values, as I told.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's great. Okay, I think I'm sorry. I think we've run out of time, so we're going. No, we've
Sorry.
5.
Oh, it's yeah.
Okay, one last question then. Well debated.
Hi, Luna Liu, Nobuo's research assistant. But so during the research with you, I have probably 2 questions and 2 comments. I think there is a base for China to accept your proposal of Great Asian integration based on Sun Yanzi's proposal about the relationship between nationalism and cosmopolitanism in China. So we know that in the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century, he proposed that China and Japan should cooperate with each other to fight against the imperialism. And he is also the person who proposed the Great Asianism that he said because we share this type of Buddhism, morality. There are a lot of common culture between Asian countries, so it's easy to promote Asianism. But on the other hand, like in the end of the 1930s, I think he warned Japan about the Japan's choices between the King's Road and the Paris Road. So Japan finally went to the Paris Road rather than the King's Road, and trying to abandon Asia, jump into the group of Western countries, and use the Great Asianism to invade the wars in Asia. So how do you think that Chinese can accept this kind of a betrayal behavior in the history to accept the regionalism right now? I mean, like how China could conquer their problem with nationalism to jump into the cosmopolitanism. And the second question is about the earthquake and tsunami this time. So a lot of people think that the Japanese invasion in Asia in 1930s was also caused by the great earthquake in Japan in the beginning of 1931. One reason is because Japanese really feel the urgency of invading to other country to keep their survivability. Another thing is the emperor at that time think this is a great opportunity to push the responsibility to foreigners to other Asian country to to keep his own power in stage. So I wonder how this earthquake will push Japan foreign policy for one thing, and how it will develop the relationship between China and Japan at this time. Sorry, it's a long question, but thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for helping all the way through these 3 months. I mean, she's been helping a lot as a research intern. And your questions. I mean, yes. I mean, I think the pre-war betrayal by the Japanese. I mean, by trying to forge the greater prosperity area in Asia wouldn't be forgiven. I mean, for the Chinese, I think. And if you ask how Chinese could accept, I mean, I would say that would be difficult, probably. That's what I guess. But what I like to propose as open nationalism and the regional grouping as a result would be something different, which would be, thought about and constructed, on the basis of the past history, after we overcome, the differences. So another wishful thinking, but I'm hoping to see the Chinese people to accept that kind of new, rapprochement with the Japanese counterparts. And the tsunami is, what I had expected was, this kind of nationalism rise much earlier. It's been nearly 2 months already, but we haven't seen much. So that fact, might suggest really, Japan's nationalism has been really tamed, for the past few decades. and even faced with such calamity, it hasn't risen.
The calamity was an internationalizing movement.
Uh-huh.
The world came and was visible.
Oh yes, I mean, but we exactly, you're right. We have accepted. I mean, not us. I'm here, but a lot of foreign relief workers. I mean, even from China this time. I mean, that might be a kind of watershed. I mean, for us to be more open to our neighbors. I mean, and we have accepted, rescue missions from South Korea too. I think that's also for the first time. We rejected the Chinese military though, but that's pretty much traditional nationalist view of not having, foreign troops on the soil. It's kind of understandable. They are not American troops.
Great. Okay, we'll wrap things up there. If you'll join me in thanking Nobu for his stimulating presentation.
Thanks so much.